Welcome to the Hudson Institute. My name is Harold Furch-Scott-Roth, and I'll be your moderator today. We're very fortunate today to have two of the leading monetary experts in the world with us. We have Brendan Brown, who's the author of Bad Money: Inflation, Mongers in War, Pandemic, and Recession. It's a wonderful book. I highly recommend it. It's just a great read. He'll be discussing his book today. And then commenting on his book is Alex Pollock, another one of the great monetary economists of our time. He's at the von Mises Institute. Brendan is a senior fellow here at the Hudson Institute, and it's my great honor to be the moderator today. Brendan will speak for about 25 minutes, and then Alex will comment on the book. And then the three of us will sit up here and take questions. And I've got a whole bunch of questions myself. So with that, please join me in welcoming Brendan Brown.
Well, thank you very much, Harold, for your kind introduction. And Harold's been a loyal supporter of my previous two books and events, and made a huge impact on me and my thinking about some of these topics. Harold's great expertise in internet economics is, in fact, more relevant to the topic of bad money than many of you in the audience might have imagined. And more on this to follow. Bad Money is not an optimistic book. In fact, much of the analysis and history there justified deep pessimism. The fiat monetary system is likely here to stay. The economic and political burden it places on society is now heavier than ever before. That burden is spread and camouflaged in ways which mean that in the political arena, monetary reform in a sound direction is not on any weighty agenda. In one chapter of the book, a 100-year study of monetary policy related to US elections reveals how hard it is for sound money to gain political traction. In fact, it's only happened twice in the last 100 years, once in 1950 to 52, in a pre-Eisenhower period in the elections, and that was accompanied by the end of the Treasury and Fed co-financing of the deficit and fixing the bond market. And then in the late mid-1970s to early 80s, when again there was limited reform, and of course the monetarist experiment, which I come on to. But again, these are the only two examples I can find in that 100-year period of monetary reform gaining traction, and it was in both cases with considerable flaws. And perhaps more amazing than anything, it didn't happen in 2024, despite the high election of the pandemic, the high inflation of the pandemic. Monetary reform just didn't figure at all in the 2024 elections. For the reader who gets to the epilogue, there is some optimism at last. And as my friend Alex Pollock says, read on till we get to there. The current fiat regime, and there's been 5 on my assessment since 1968, is plausibly the worst. Judgment about the badness of the present fiat regime, in fact, as I say, the 5th since the final extinction of any gold link for the dollar in 1968 to 71, remains tentative because we don't know yet how this regime will end. But tentatively, it seems fairly bleak at this point. We are now in the longest monetary inflation ever, again, in the reckonings in the book. The previous longest monetary inflations in the US without any break were 1938 to 1948, and then from 1962 to 73. We're now on a 14-year monetary inflation without break. The record sheet of the current fiat regime, the so-called 2% inflation standard, which took power de facto already in the late 1990s, includes several black marks. Worst, when I talk about bad monetary regimes, is not necessarily reported CPI inflation, but other aspects of bad money which weigh on prosperity and freedom in the economy. Evidence of badness of a present regime, the 2% inflation standard, includes the great financial crisis and the actual great monetary inflation from 2010-12 onwards. And this great monetary inflation has spawned endemic asset inflation with bubbles to match, and has had ugly manifestations, which include first the great pandemic inflation of the early 2020s and its aftermath, the record deterioration in public finances during peacetime, and last and not least, the pernicious malinvestment, which has continued along with the growth in monopoly capitalism. All of this I attribute in the book to the monetary regime in a considerable degree. And malinvestment includes, crucially, distortions to free market process of innovation, and this is where I come back to Harold's work on innovation and internet economics. Under sound money, innovation, the process of innovation, is subject to benign, powerful breaks. Old and new technologies coexist for a considerable time, whilst the journey into the forest of the unknown is typically slow. The guardrail of sober rationality holds. By contrast, when you have innovation driven by monetary inflation in the context particularly of asset inflation and sometimes mania, the process of going into the forest of the unknown gathers speed. And this has been particularly relevant in the actual digitalization revolution, which has featured euphoria about prospective monopoly profits, the key potential for winning firms which develop and apply the new technologies. The book draws a key chain of causality from bad money via malinvestment and monopoly capitalism to an overall weak growth in mean living standards during the past 2 decades. And in turn, this has fueled populism. But this chain of causality from bad money to low growth in prosperity has not fueled monetary reform. Corruption of the innovation process by monetary inflation is nothing new. We can go back in US history to the railroads and Fogel's work on that subject. But what I would stress here is that the monetary inflation and the malinvestment during that period seems to be of a considerable lesser degree than what we have in the present case, and the growth in living standards correspondingly less. Digitalization is a fertile field for speculative narratives such as flourish in asset inflation, in part because of the monopoly profit prospects and also the delayed emergence of critical dangers. By the time these materialize, it's too late for society to turn the clock back to include older technologies alongside, and the industries to combat the dangers that become apparent with a lag are themselves the source of huge profit opportunity. If the huge security flaws of the internet had been judiciously weighted and given time to emerge, as would have happened under sound money regimes, would digitalization have been slower? That's one of the counterfactuals examined in Bad Money. Another aspect of badness of the present regime has been the corruption of a monetary system. The novel toxic box of unconventional tools, including interest on reserves, supersized financial system bailouts, the monetary system no longer has in consequence a functional monetary basis pivot. And instead, the Fed seeks to exert monetary control by simply moving the policy interest rate. this procedure is in flagrant contradiction of what used to be a key lesson of Money 101, that interest rates and monetary conditions have no stable relationship to each other. I would stress, and this is perhaps one factor in why the gold price is near $4,000, that optimism on a reform of the fiat money system has dwindled under this last fiat regime of a 2% inflation standard compared to the high expectations on monetary reform we had back in the 1970s or even the early 1980s. The optimism of that time had much to do with the apparent success of monetarism in Germany and Switzerland through the 1970s. That optimism was dashed when Volcker abandoned in 1985 his brief monetarist experiment, joining with the dollar devaluation policies of the second Reagan administration. There was another historic opportunity for sound money reform in the early mid-1990s after the Greenspan Fed got inflation back down again and asset inflation from the late 1980s bust. But that opportunity was missed. We had no sound money reform, and instead the Fed went on to the so-called 2% inflation standard. And I think it's interesting to see that failure to have sound money reform in the 1990s, along with other missed opportunities which happened at the same time, missed opportunity to foster democracy in Russia, missed opportunity to depose dictatorship in China. And in many ways, that combination of missed monetary opportunity and missed geopolitical opportunity we had in the 1990s has many echoes with the much better known lost opportunity of the 1920s, when again there was a chance of geopolitical reconciliation and there was a chance of monetary reform, both of which were botched and fed on each other to produce the disasters that followed. What we had from the 1990s was the Greenspan decision at the end of the 1990s, taken very closely, one has to assume, with the neo-Keynesians at the top of the economic team of the Clinton administration, to go forward with this perpetual 2% inflation standard. Possibly a sixth US fiat regime is in the works, if you read the media, and possibly a sixth French Republic is also in the works. But I wouldn't pin much hope on either producing a meaningful improvement. Before I unveil the two properties which I consider as essential to any monetary reform, I want to take this intermission to introduce Alex Pollock, who is my longtime friend and soulmate in idealistic enthusiasm for good money over a quarter century. As a philosopher, he follows Voltaire in blending realism with idealism and pessimism with optimism. I've wondered sometimes whether if Voltaire had also been a political economist, as indeed were the Scottish contemporary philosophers, including David Hume and Adam Smith, he would have followed up his statement, if God did not exist, we would have to create him, with another statement, if gold money did not exist, it would have to be created. And I think that's maybe where we are now. Well, my friend Alex Pollock is a philosopher and economist and writes in his great work, Finance and Philosophy, Why We Are Always Surprised. He writes the following: the future is unknowable, we're confused by the present, and we misinterpret the past. I was very much aware of that judgment when I wrote this book about bad money and war, pandemic, and recession, which contains much about the past, the present, as well as some conjectures about the future. Well, coming back to the two fundamental flaws of the fiat dollar regime, I would say the first defect, and particularly acute in the present 2% inflation standard, is the way that it brutally represses any possible episodes of prices falling to a lower than normal level. Such episodes of lower prices would correspond ideally to circumstances such as a spurt in productivity sudden supply abundance after famine, or business cycle downturn. Episodes of rising and falling prices along a broadly flat trend over a very long run are essential to the benign workings of free market capitalism and to the given money's reputation as a store of value. Expectations that prices will rise back to normal from a below normal level should ideally play a crucial role in balancing spending in the economy over time without the need for policy interventions. These interventions, incidentally, have included and induced monetary distortions with all their ill consequences. I return to this point of the benignness of price falls as part of a long-run stability in the historical examples to follow, but what I would say at this stage is perpetual inflation or even perpetually stable prices with no dips are a form of monetary hell. Second defect in the fiat system, particularly what we have now, is there is no solid anchor for the fiat dollar. This in principle, a solid anchor in principle would prevent economic storms, especially supply shocks, and even indirect tax increases such as tariffs, rocking the monetary system and causing the money to get out of control. In other words, monetary inflation. The monetary anchor essentially works by imposing a tight grip on the supply of base money, and this base money enjoys strong and stable demand even though no interest paid on it. And so a lurch upwards, for example, of prices, whether caused by shortages, famine, or tariffs, set off automatically monetary reaction forces which bring the prices back down again. This lack of anchor and suppression of falling prices mean that the fiat dollar regime has been highly inflationary in all senses, not just goods markets, but also in asset markets. I've just mentioned here that asset inflation is not just a matter of looking at whether the equity market is rising to new highs. That's a very simplistic and wrong way of looking at asset inflation. The essence of asset inflation is pervasive irrationality, overlapping irrational exuberance, as driven in particular by corruption of the long-term interest rate market. You're all familiar, I'm sure, with Schiller's work on irrational exuberance. What is missing in the title of that book by Schiller is the monetary connection. Irrational exuberance doesn't just come out of nowhere. Irrational exuberance comes out of monetary inflation. Well, this book illustrates hard money, bad money, the fundamental failings of a fiat money dollar regime, particularly the one we have at the moment, lack of anchor and repression of falling prices. And as examples of wars where this has failed is, first of all, the Korean War, secondly, the Vietnam War, and thirdly, the Iraq and war against terror. Under a sound money regime, the story would have been prices would be higher during the war itself, as resulting from supply disruptions and some contraction in real incomes, meaning less demand for money. And once the war is over, prices would fall. In fact, the expectation that prices would fall after the war mean that people spend less during the war without rationing or some other forced form of saving. This didn't happen during any of these wars. Indeed, in the aftermath of the Korean War, prices were stable or continued to rise rather than coming back down the 10% they climbed during the Korean War. And Remartin, in fact, took advantages of a tendency to lower prices and, in fact, an economic miracle which was happening at the time to keep interest rates abnormally low, which in turn stimulated asset inflation and all the talk about removing punch bowls. Then we had the Vietnam War, which in terms of other wars did not entail a large budgetary deficit, but wars are unpopular, particularly the Vietnam War, and so the administrations at the time pursued other policies which contributed to a monetary inflation outcome. When the Vietnam War came to an end, differently from what would have happened under sound money, prices didn't decline, but they went ahead at no less than a 5% inflation rate and continued into a higher inflation rate beyond that. And then we come to the Iraq War, war on terror. Again, the budgetary cost of that war was not anything which in itself meant that the government had to turn to inflationary finance or money printing. But elections had to be won, particularly the looming 2004 election. So Larry Lindsay, who perhaps was the only Austrian-type economist that's been in the Fed at any stage, and was head of the George W. Bush economics team, was fired because he was warning about the cost of the war. And simultaneously, Bernanke was brought into the Fed and Greenspan put on a tight leash to produce monetary inflation financing towards winning the 2004 elections. In fact, when we look at this episode historically, the 2004 run-up to the 2004 in monetary terms was not very different from the Nixon shock of 1970 to 72. As a historical footnote, I would say that some wars have indeed been fought without any break in sound money. If we look further back in history, the Franco-Prussian War, the Russian-Japanese War, even the Napoleon's wars were financed with the countries concerned, France in the case of the Napoleonic Wars, remaining on the gold standard. Then we come to the present trade, economic conflict, and what that alongside entails in terms of an increase in indirect taxation. Under sound money, there would inevitably have been some monetary tightness created by these rise in prices related to that, and as a solid anchor, that would have reined the price rises back. Instead of which, we've had the opposite happening, and asset inflation clearly matching that development. At some stage, if the trade war is rolled back, or if indeed the policy vis-a-vis China does lead to some enhanced productivity in the United States, none of which we should rule out, but under a good monetary regime, all of that would see lower prices. In fact, what we're most likely to see, if any of that materializes, is another excuse for the Fed to pursue lower than otherwise interest rates and a continuation of monetary inflation. Then we come to the pandemic. The point I would make about the pandemic is, first of all, under a good money system, this would not have led to massive budget deficits. They would have been impossible to finance. And there would have been some sort of solidarity tax program essential towards meeting the requirements of expenditure in the pandemic. But even more crucially, once the pandemic faded away, prices should have fallen back. We should have seen the reverse of price rises when supply chains were dislocated. Instead of which, in autumn 2022, the Powell Fed took the deliberate decision to pull back from a severe monetary tightening and take advantage of the decline in prices which was coming about because of the resumption of supply chains to introduce more monetary inflation into the system, which of course showed up with the powerful asset inflation continuing beyond the pandemic into 2023, 2024. Finally, to talk about the recessions, the third topic of the book, Bad Money. In a big recession, you would expect prices to fall below normal, and the expectation of prices coming back to normal would be one of the mechanisms by which the economy picks itself up. In fact, in the aftermath of the 2008 great financial crisis, we had the reverse of that, with the Bernanke Fed aiming for 2% inflation through the aftermath of a great recession. the result being colossal asset price inflation, of which the focus was the biggest of all bubble in China, essentially part of the dollar zone in some respects, and a non-ending asset inflation. We don't know how this asset inflation in the world is going to end, but we have to remind ourselves it's the longest monetary inflation in the history lab, so we may get an ending which is not in keeping with what we already have observed in that laboratory. So to sum up, monetary reform is difficult because the two defects of the existing fiat system, lack of solid anchor and repression of falling prices, are very difficult to do something about without a lot of political pushback. To foster a strong and broad demand for monetary base in a fiat system is pretty well impossible unless you roll back general deposit insurance, too big to fail, and the war on cash, all of which are weighty political issues. The question I ask at the end of the book, in the epilogue, is if it's so difficult to have fiat money reform, maybe it's easier to go the full distance and introduce gold back into the system, because gold as a monetary base does enjoy a natural strong demand, not least as haven. Even in the days of the gold standard, there was a weighty demand for the monetary base in the form of gold in case the gold standard came to an end. No, there's no such natural demand for monetary base in a fiat monetary system. So the question I leave you with is whether gold, as part of the reform, could have an easier political ride to get the whole process going to a satisfactory conclusion than keeping banging the table on pure fiat reform. And at this stage, I defer to my friend Alex.
Thank you, Harold, for your fine comments. Thanks, Brendan, for quoting one of my favorite lines. And thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us. It's a pleasure to be here to discuss Brendan's new book, Bad Money, in which he ranges widely over monetary theory and monetary history, with their related histories of economics, politics, and war, while constantly contrasting bad money with good. Now, as we know, good money, what that means is a money with stable purchasing power and value over time on average. And bad money is the perpetually depreciating money dropping in value, in which the government and the central bank impose perpetual inflation on the people. That's the money we've got, needless to say. Now, if we think about the reality, there are, of course, millions of prices, and at all times, some prices are going up and some are going down. But on average, if we think about a tendency, a central tendency of the prices, at some periods, those average prices will be rising, certainly as long as there are wars and as long as there are crises to be financed. Now, what Brendan, and as I read it, wants us to understand is that it turns out for prices to be stable over time, since at some times they'll obviously be rising, at other times they have to fall. So here is Brendan's fundamental proposition. If prices, on average, don't fall sometimes, you can't have stable prices over time. But should average prices ever fall? Not if those Brendan calls the inflation mongers or inflation peddlers, or we could just say shortly the inflationists. Not if they have their way, because they want, as Brendan says, repression of any periodic tendency for prices to fall. We won't let prices fall. And what that means is that Supply shocks, which raise prices, instead of being an adjustment where they rise and then fall, sends prices, in Brendan's words, to a permanently higher level. And this reflects the Keynesian perpetual pump priming, Brendan's nice phrase, that is constant intervention instead of occasional emergency intervention, which goes along with perpetual inflation, just as the Fed has promised. They promised 2% inflation forever. Or is it maybe 3%? Or maybe more, but always inflation. Now, because inflation mongers focus on the rate at which prices are rising and not the ever higher level of prices, we get the paradox. We simultaneously have the papers full of the announcement that inflation is falling, while in fact prices are still high and still rising. So you read inflation is falling. Of course, all that means is the rate of increase in prices is going down. But when you go to the grocery, the prices are still high, and in fact, they're constantly always getting higher. Well, if we don't want that, then prices have to fall. But if you're afraid always of falling prices, in short, if you suffer from what Brendan calls deflation phobia, then you just don't want that to happen, and the alternative is perpetual inflation. However, as Brendan discusses, deflation is a natural and healthy result when there are periods of great innovation and rapid increases in productivity, and therefore rising real wages. Inflation is naturally negative, or we have deflation because of the productivity. But as an inflationist, you don't want that. So as Brendan says, there is no way to suppress the natural rhythm of prices downwards except monetary inflation, which in turn spawns the diseases of asset inflation with camouflaged inflation in goods and services market. The monetary suppression of the natural rhythm, Brendan writes, of the natural rhythm of prices is an important factor in the persistence of asset inflation during the now 30-year history of the 2% inflation regime. So to interpret that a little bit, that tells us there are three kinds of inflation. There's monetary inflation, the inflation of money. There are goods and services prices, and there are asset prices, and the three have to be thought of separately but together. So if we have the goods and services prices naturally falling due to increased productivity, and the monetary authority doesn't like prices to ever fall, so they inflate the money to offset the fall, we might get a resulting goods and services inflation which sounds fairly low or fairly benign, like maybe 2%, when in the market the prices would actually have been falling. And what will happen then is that the monetary inflation will appear in asset inflation, otherwise known as bubbles, which is indeed our experience so far in this century. So along with this, the inflation mongers display a new tendency in central banking, which is, as Brendan says, they are bellicose about getting inflation up. This is really astonishing in a historical situation to have central bankers so anxious to get inflation up as they actually talk about and do. To get inflation up if it's below 2%. They turn swiftly and severely, Brendan writes, to a policy of stepped up monetary inflation in response to any shortfall of inflation below 2%. And as I said, this is certainly an amazing contrast to the traditional anti-inflationist central banker. Now, let's say, for example, the natural tendency in a productive period would have been for prices to be falling 1%. We don't like prices to fall, so we inflate the money, and that gets inflation up to 2%. And we say, well, 2%, that's not bad. But actually, it's 3%. It's the difference between the 1, the -1, and the +2. And of course, it can be much more than that. And that higher inflation will come out in asset price inflation, otherwise known as bubbles. And just to be clear, in case you're not sure what Brendan thinks about the 2% inflation forever doctrine, in his opinion, it's the madness, I'm quoting, the madness of the 2% inflation standard and its associated virulent asset inflations, otherwise known as bubbles. We've already had 2 bubbles in house prices in the 21st century in this country. And this century is only 25 years old. Brendan observes about this 21st century period, quoting, the bizarre nature of the Powell Fed's continued preoccupation through 2020 with the theme of inflation is too low. Inflation is too low. We have it, but we want more. And indeed, as part of this theme, the Fed kept buying mortgage securities, stoking house price inflation, driving up, as it helped stoke the first bubble, driving up the second house price bubble. So now we have a resulting housing affordability crisis. I can't help mentioning, and Brendan doesn't discuss this, but I want to mention it, that in addition, this theme of pushing on the house price and other asset price bubbles through the 2% inflation has resulted in a loss by the Federal Reserve of about $1 trillion. That's $244 billion in operating losses so far in the last 3 years. The Fed has lost $244 billion, and on top of that, as of June 30th anyway, they had a $900 billion mark-to-market loss. You have to add those together. The Fed is down $1 trillion. That's really an interesting result of the inflation mongering period and the 2% inflation doctrine. So there have been a lot of discussion lately about 2% inflation or 3%. Well, 2% to 3%, you might say that's a 1% increase in inflation. But as Herb Stein said, the difference between 2% and 3% is not 1%, it's 50%. 3% inflation is 50% more inflation than 2%. But if you expand that over a lifetime, let's say 80 years of 2%, in a lifetime, 2% inflation means prices go up 5 times. 3% inflation in a lifetime means prices go up 10 times. So in that sense, 3% is 100% more than 2%. Now, I really enjoyed Brendan's historical discussions. They're extremely interesting. And in particular, his survey, which he discussed in his comments, of the intertwining of inflation, money, and war. The book covers the Napoleonic Wars, the American Civil War, the Second World War, Korea, Vietnam, and Iraq, but most importantly, the First World War, that suicide of European civilization, with its abandoning the gold standard, its vast inflation, and then hyperinflations afterward, its vast war debts, later almost all defaulted on, and also, interestingly, the development of Switzerland as a monetary haven. And the book has a very interesting chapter on Switzerland as a monetary haven to get away from the inflation mongers in all the other countries, including this one. So in the book, the First World War comes out as the original sin of the 20th century monetary developments. And Brendan quotes his co-author and friend, Philippe Simonnot, quote, "We surely all realize It's not sufficient to explain the chaos of global economic systems to go back to the autumn of 2008. It is that month of August 1914 where the traveler backwards through time gets to the bottom of the search for an explanation of our monetary problems. In a few hours, the convertibility of paper money was abandoned. End of the quote. Well, now let's come to 2025. As you heard, on monetary reform, Brendan is pessimistic because the cause of sound money is politically inactive, especially in relation to the fiery debates of the 1890s, say, with its famous "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold" speech of William Jennings Bryan. But to Bryan, we might reply, well, equally, "You shall not drown mankind in a flood of paper money." Or perhaps, "You shall not rob mankind by your perpetual inflation." I'll close with what Brendan would do now. And it's a good list, and it comes right at the end of the book, nicely put together. 1, a near-term aim should be the withdrawal of the central bank from setting short-term interest rates. Why do we need a government price-fixing committee for interest rates? If you reflect on it, it's ridiculous, as Brendan says. 2, deflation phobia should fade away. We have to understand the role of falling as well as rising prices. 3, there should be a new and hard constitutional guardrails against the monetary fueling of big government, including tight limits on central bank balance sheet expansion. 4, we have to recognize that inflation is implicit default on government debt, as indeed it is. 5, since, and you heard Brendan talk about this, since gold convertibility of the dollar provides a much stronger guardrail than is possible under any fiat money constitutionalism, gold would be ideal as the base for a sound money system. And in this context, Brendan suggests in the book that we follow the interesting experiment now going on in Texas, where at the state level, Texas is trying to develop a gold-based currency in Texas. This would be a remonetization of gold, and they're trying to create a currency because it's 100% gold backed with the gold in the state gold depository. They're trying to develop a money sounder than the US dollar. But as Brendan reminds us, always remember when we're talking about gold that there is a risk, and the risk is that the government will confiscate the gold that you have or force you to exchange it for bad money, for depreciating paper money, just as the US did in 1933. So there's a risk to be considered. In sum, Brendan has given us a provocative book filled with conceptual insights and historical insights. He knows, as you heard him say, that the path from bad money to sound money is not an easy one, but as Keynes famously said, in the long run, it is ideas that have power. And it's great, I think, to have these sound money ideas articulated by Brendan in this book and understood in their historical and current political context. Keep up the good work, Brendan. Thank you.
Well, gentlemen, thank you for those excellent presentations. Well, we'll take some questions from the audience, and I'll take the moderator's prerogative of asking some questions as well. Let's start with the audience. Questions for Brendan Brown. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Jordan McGillis, Economic Innovation Group, formerly of City Journal. I'm a real novice on these issues, so bear with me. I'm going to toss a couple questions out there since I didn't see too many hands up. First, can you explain the most important mechanisms by which the Fed or the federal government more broadly instantiates inflation? Two, can you explain why people say tariffs would cause inflation? That seems very contradictory to me, considering the tax rise, there'd be deadweight loss. It seems like it should be somewhat deflationary. And then third, as a household, how do you beat inflation?
On the first question as to how the Fed creates inflation, you're hitting a very important point, because we're in a monetary context now where the monetary base or money supply are not a very meaningful aggregate. So inflation comes about essentially through the money having a excess stimulatory effect and an expectational effect, but the way in which that's happening in real time is very hard to identify. There are proxies for that. For example, trying to look at nominal interest rates versus natural rates and whether interest rates are too low. But they're very hard to conceptualize, because nobody knows what the natural rate is or the neutral rate. So we see what we see. But I think if you see have the evidence of shortages, commodity price rises, asset inflation in many ways typically comes before goods and services inflation. So asset inflation is a lead indicator very often of goods and services inflation. But the means towards getting to that inflation somehow will be that there was excess money and credit growth and interest rates were too low, but it's all very imprecise. The question as to how you can protect yourself as savings, I think that was your third point, the protecting savings from inflation. Again, gold does stand out there, but I would always quote the story that by the time the Germans occupied Paris in June 1940, the gold price in the black market had already got beyond the highest point it ever got for the rest of the war. So gold is only a hedge or a safety means against inflation if you're in it before everybody knows about it. And that's critically means that you can't automatically assume that gold is going to protect your savings. If you would want to add.
No, and the second question was about tariffs, why they're...
Tariffs. Tariffs, there's two aspects to tariffs. One is that they're like a supply shock, that trade war with China means less cheap goods coming in, and so that's like a supply shock. The second aspect of tariffs is it's a partial consumption tax on imported goods, but not on non-imported goods. Now, under a sound money system, both of those things, a supply shock and or an indirect tax increase, those price rises would tend to create a shortage of money supply, which is only growing in the long run very slowly, and money demand, which suddenly grows because of the higher prices. So the immediate reaction there would be some sort of money shortage, interest rates going up, people finding themselves short of money balances, and that would exert a downward influence on prices coming back down again. So I would say that under sound money or under a gold standard, tariffs would not lead to a permanent rise in prices, or maybe it'd be a temporary rise in prices, but that would come back down again. So I disagree fundamentally with the view which you are hearing quite a lot of at the moment, that if tariffs just lead to a once and for all price rise, that's okay. It's not okay. And the other aspect is that at some stage it's very likely that tariffs will be rolled back or nullified or whatever by either Supreme Court or for political, in an election, the non-tariff party wins. Whenever that happens, or even if tariffs work in the long run and produce a productivity growth surge because of China malpractices being curbed, all of those should lead to lower prices. But in practice, with the Fed as we know it, it's not going to allow prices to fall. So we would have another episode of monetary inflation coming about.
We just add the simple point at the bottom is in a pure fiat money system, which we've had since 1971 at least, I call this the Nixonian era of world monetary policy, there is no limit to the amount of money that can be created by the central banks. In principle, there's only judgment, guessing, political motivations. And there is no limit in principle to what the central bank can buy with the money they make up and create by writing credits in their books. There is at law or in practice, but different central banks around the world they can buy stocks, or they could buy mortgages. Big mistake in my mind. But both of those you can see directly feeding into the perpetual inflation of prices and the periodic inflation of the perpetual inflation of goods and services prices and the periodic overinflation of asset prices.
We have a question there.
Hi, I'm Silas James. I'm a sophomore in American. And my question is, I know you said that inflation equals implicit default. Is there any line that can be crossed where we can't just go back to the gold standard to prevent that? And my other question would be, is there any lessons we can learn from, say, the fall of the British Empire that could help us out here?
Going on to a gold standard, of course it can happen. You can suddenly make the dollar convertible into gold, but there are huge political issues alongside that. Once you do that, what happens to all the outstanding government debt? Very likely there would have to be some sort of partial default or rescheduling of the 130% or whatever prospective debt to GDP ratio. So that's first point. And then secondly, there's a lot of institutions and relationships which are built on the idea of bailouts, lender of last resort. There would be some sort of shock effect to absorb in the financial system. But yes, I mean, all of that is doable. The question is over what period and what's the political will to do any of that. Lessons that can be learned from the British Empire and the fall of sterling, but none of it was inevitable. I mean, when you look at the departure from gold in 1931, the inflation of the 1950s and 60s, none of that was inevitable. I mean, sterling could have been a hard money, not necessarily enjoying the neutrality benefits that the Swiss franc enjoyed, but nonetheless substantial attributes to a British currency that could have been a safe haven currency. So I would tend to be skeptical about any inevitability in the decline of the British pound story.
I think the first part of that question might have been addressed to me about inflation as default. When governments get in trouble with their debt, and we should be clear about what really in trouble means. In trouble means people are no longer willing to buy it, at least at an interest rate that you're willing to pay. Then, and you're in a debt problem, there are four and only four things you can do about it. One is explicit default. Well, we're not paying, such as Britain defaulted on its war debt to the United States. Argentina. Well, there have been 200. If you believe Rogoff and Reinhardt, there have been 250 defaults on sovereign debt in the last 200 years. So that's more than one a year. That includes 4 defaults by the United States, which I won't go into. But one is default. The second is to cut your expenses. I mean, if you really had the inability to get your central bank to keep financing you, and therefore to inflate, you could cut the expenses. That's known as austerity, and politicians don't like it, and the voters who benefit from getting the money don't like it. So default, austerity. The third is inflation. You tell your central bank, by the way, boys, I really need you to buy these bonds. I need the money. I'm running deficits. Buy up these bonds. And central banks typically do that. And then you inflate, and the value of the debt falls, and you have an implicit default. And the fourth possibility is what's known as financial repression. That is things like confiscating all the gold your citizens may have bought, forcing interest rates to low levels, especially to negative real rates, so that you're actually expropriating the savers' savings in order to spend on other things, having all kinds of regulations, forcing banks, say, to buy the government debt by various regulations. And countries don't generally like, unless they have no alternative to default, they don't like cutting their expenses. Inflation is the easier route, plus financial repression. So that's the scenario of when the debt really does become overly burdensome. And overly burdensome means that the buyers are no longer willing to buy it. That fair?
Yeah, definitely.
Other questions? I'm going to ask one. I think it's a wonderful title, Bad Money. I'm sort of reminded of the Super Bowl halftime show coming up, Bad Bunny, and I think Bad Money is a lot more interesting than Bad Money. Tell us a bit about your co-author and your interactions with him. It's in the introduction. I thought it was a wonderful story.
Well, Philippe was introduced to me by a German professor who, in fact, was part of the anti-Euro movement there. And he said to me, Philippe is one of perhaps the only hard money, classical monetary economist left in France today. He was about 10 years older than myself. And he said to Philippe, he must read some of my articles and books. So Philippe had approached me and said, you must send me your last 3 books. And my English isn't so great, although in fact it was very good, and we'll communicate he wrote to me in French, which I can understand, but I can't really write it very well. So my dialogue with him was me speaking English and then replying to me in French. And we'd had this dialogue going for about several years. And then he said to me, well, why don't we publish a book on a dialogue book, which we did several years ago. And then after that, we got onto a second book. He passed away when we were working on that, and it changed from being a dialogue book into more like a traditional narrative book. I'm sure it would have been much more readable in a dialogue if Philippe had still been here. But certainly a lot of my thinking and ideas on these topics came from this wonderful dialogue I had with Philippe, and I miss very, very much.
Well, please join me in thanking Brendan for his wonderful book. Tell your friends about it. It's Bad Money, not Bad Money, but Bad Money's a better title, I think. So, thank you.
Thank you.